Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're really locking in on a hugely transformative and, frankly, often violent period in American history.
That's right. We're talking about the closing of the American frontier, roughly between 1877 and 1898.
And if you think the story of the West kind of wraps up with, gold rushes and pioneers and covered wagons, well, our sources paint a much more complex picture for this later era.
Absolutely. It's a period defined by big finance, pretty devastating government policy, and a really significant human cost.
So the idea of this deep dive is to unpack that. We want to look at the sources detailing why there was this huge surge in settlement.
What the economic realities actually were for the settlers moving west.
And crucially, the systematic violence and the policy shifts that just fundamentally changed life for American Indians and Mexican Americans as that traditional idea of the frontier was declared gone.
It's really this collision, isn't it, between American ideals, that kind of Jeffersonian dream of owning land, being self-sufficient.
Yeah, independence.
Exactly, that powerful ideal driving people west, but colliding head-on with the realities of, well, industrial money and outright conquest. Achieving that dream for some meant systemic land seizure from others.
Right. That's the core tension we need to explore.
It's the moment the nation sort of fulfills its geographic expansion, but maybe at the cost of some core ideals it claimed to uphold.
Okay, so let's start with the why. What was pulling so many people west in these specific decades, 1877 to 1898?
It was a massive draw. Opportunity seemed everywhere, not just farming, though that was huge, but also railroads were booming, mining continued, ranching took off.
And it wasn't just one type of person moving, right? Our sources talk about a real mix.
Definitely. You have the classic homesteaders, of course, but also significant movements like the black settlers heading west to escape the post-Reconstruction South, the exodusters, as they were known, a diverse migration.
And all this movement, this filling up of the map, culminates in a really famous moment.
Yeah, 1890. The U.S. Census Bureau makes this official declaration. The frontier line, that sort of edge of continuous settlement, is gone. The country is, in their view, settled.
Symbolized maybe by things like the Oklahoma land rush a year earlier, which we'll get to.
Right, a very visible sign of that closing.
Now, this declaration wasn't just a statistic. For some people, it triggered a kind of intellectual crisis.
It really did. This is where the historian Frederick Jackson Turner steps in. In 1893, he delivers his incredibly influential paper, later an essay called The Significance of the Frontier in American History.
Okay, so what was his big idea?
Turner's argument, basically, was that the frontier had always been America's essential safety valve.
Safety valve, meaning what?
Meaning it was a place where discontent could dissipate. If you were struggling in the East, if things weren't working out, you could always head west, start over, get land.
Ah, okay, a release mechanism.
Exactly. And he argued this process wasn't just economic, it was democratic. It leveled society, broke down class distinctions, and constantly renewed American identity by forcing people back to sort of first principles.
So his fear was, if that valve, that frontier, is now declared closed.
Then what happens to all that discontent? He worried America would become like Europe, rigid, stratified, and prone to, serious class conflict. Without the frontier, was America still America?
Yeah.
That was his underlying question.
It's a powerful idea, but when Turner talks about this safety valve for, let's be frank, white American discontent, does he engage with the fact that this empty land wasn't empty at all?
That's the huge critique looking back. Turner's thesis, groundbreaking as it was then, largely overlooks the immense violence and displacement of native populations required to create that open frontier for settlers.
So the democratizing force for one group was simultaneously a force of conquest for another.
Precisely. The cost of that safety valve is often missing from his original framework. We see that cost playing out in the very conflicts we're discussing.
And those economic anxieties Turner had about class conflict building up, they weren't entirely theoretical, were they? If the geographic escape route was closing, that economic pressure had to go somewhere.
Absolutely. Which brings us right to the economic engines of the era. You have the railroads, first and foremost, just fundamentally reshaping everything: migration, trade, access.
And the promise of land itself, driven by federal policy. Let's talk about the Homestead Act.
Right, the Homestead Act of 1862, a cornerstone policy. It offered 160 acres of federal land. The catch: you had to live on it, improve it, usually meaning farm it for 5 years, and then it was yours. Free.
Free land. That's the American dream packaged up, isn't it? These were the famous sogbusters.
Yep, that's the nickname, because breaking that tough prairie sod was incredibly hard work. You literally had to bust through it.
The sources seem to suggest that this dream quickly ran into some harsh realities. The free part wasn't quite so simple.
Not at all. That's the sharp irony. Okay, the land itself might be free, but farming it wasn't. You needed money up front for tools, seed, maybe some livestock, building materials. Getting started required capital most settlers didn't have.
So, debt.
Crushing debt for many.
Yeah.
And the numbers are telling. Only about maybe 1/5 of settlers actually got their land title through the full 5-year Homestead Act process.
So what happened to the others? Where did they get land?
Well, here's the kicker. Many ended up buying land, and often they bought it from the very railroad companies that were crisscrossing the West.
How did the railroads have so much land to sell?
The government gave it to them. Millions upon millions of acres in land grants as incentives to build the transcontinental lines. So the railroads became massive landowners, and they sold plots, often near their tracks, to settlers. The federal promise, in a way, ended up fueling private land speculation.
Wow. Okay, so the small homesteader is already struggling. What about that other iconic Western figure, the cowboy? The cattle drives.
Ah, the open range. For a time, the Great Plains were the heart of a massive cattle industry. Huge herds driven north to railheads. It created that powerful, romantic image.
But that era ended really fast, didn't it? And not because of shootouts.
Nope. It was something much more mundane, but revolutionary.
Barbed wire.
Barbed wire. Simple invention.
Incredibly simple, cheap to produce, and highly effective at fencing off huge areas. It spread like wildfire across the plains in the 1870s and 80s.
And what did that do to the cattle drives?
It killed them. Barbed wire ended the open range, land became privatized, fenced off. Ranching changed from vast open grazing to more managed, enclosed operations. It's a classic example of a simple technology just completely disrupting an entire economic system and really a way of life.
And that theme of technology changing things. It wasn't just ranching, right? Agriculture was changing too.
Big time. Mechanization was increasing, new plows, reapers, threshers. Farming was becoming more efficient, but also more expensive. You needed capital to buy and maintain this machinery.
So the little guy, the sodbuster with 160 acres, couldn't keep up. Increasingly, no. It led to consolidation. Small farms, often burdened by debt, couldn't compete with larger operations that could afford the technology. They folded,
And the land.
got snapped up by bigger outfits. You start to see the rise of what we now call agribusiness, large-scale, capitalized farming, replacing that ideal of the small, independent yeoman farmer.
So you have this pressure cooker, waves of settlers, land privatization, economic hardship, technological disruption.
Yeah.
It sounds like conflict was unavoidable.
Absolutely inevitable. This massive influx of people, all competing for land and resources, led directly to intense, often violent conflict between white settlers, American Indians, and also Mexican Americans who had long been in parts of the West.
Let's focus on the impact on Native Americans first. What was the single biggest factor that undermined the Plains cultures?
Without a doubt, the destruction of the American bison, the buffalo.
Wasn't just overhunting, was it?
No, it was much more than that. It was partly commercial hunting for hides, partly sport hunting, facilitated by the railroad, shoot buffalo from the train windows, that kind of thing. But it was also deliberate U.S. military strategy.
Strategy, how so?
The military recognized that the bison was central to the Plains Indians' way of life. Food, shelter, tools, spiritual life, everything. Destroy the buffalo and you destroy their independence, their ability to resist.
And the effect.
Catastrophic. As the herds vanished, plummeting from tens of millions to maybe a few hundred by the late 1880s, Plains tribes lost their primary resource. It forced them onto reservations and into dependence on government rations, which were often inadequate and used as a tool of control. It fundamentally broke their self-sufficiency.
And this conflict over land and resources wasn't just between settlers and Native Americans. Mexican Americans faced similar pressures, right? Especially ranchers, the original Lugaros.
Yes, absolutely. In areas like the Southwest, Mexican Americans who had held land, often through Spanish or Mexican land grants for generations, found their claims challenged, their land encroached upon, and their economic independence eroded as Anglo-American ranchers and businesses moved in and increasingly dominated.
Did they resist this?
They certainly did. Our sources highlight groups like Las Gordas Blancas, the Whitecaps in New Mexico in the late 1880s.
What did they do?
They were an organized resistance movement. They protested the seizure and fencing of communal lands by Anglo ranchers and land speculators. They rode at night, cut down the new barbed wire fences, burned barns and haystacks, destroyed property.
targeting the symbols of that enclosure, the barbed wire again?
Exactly. It was direct action against the privatization and seizure of lands they considered rightfully theirs or communally held. It shows the conflict was fundamentally about who controls the land and how it's used.
And this whole process of seizure reaches a kind of fever pitch with events like the Oklahoma land rush in 1889. We see images of it, the chaos, but what was actually happening there?
Well, it's often romanticized as this great race for free land, but the reality is starker. These were designated unassigned lands within Indian Territory lands, theoretically belonging to native nations, but declared surplus or open by the government.
So basically, land taken from tribes and given away to white settlers in a single chaotic day.
That's essentially it, a massive legally sanctioned land grab, opening up 2 million acres previously controlled by native peoples.
This points to a broader pattern then. The U.S. government wasn't just allowing conflict, it was actively structuring the takeover of land through policy and sometimes broken promises.
Systematically, the foundation of much of this era's policy was the violation of existing treaties. Agreements that had guaranteed land and sovereignty to native nations were frequently ignored or unilaterally overturned, often backed by military force to relocate tribes or enforce new boundaries.
Was there a specific moment, a legal shift, that really formalized this change in relationship?
Yes, a crucial one was the Indian Appropriation Act of 1871. This was a fundamental shift.
How so?
It essentially declared that the U.S. government would no longer recognize native tribes as independent nations with whom they could make treaties. It nullified all past treaties and effectively positioned the U.S. as the sole sovereign power.
So no more negotiating as equals, even theoretically.
Exactly. From then on, native peoples were treated as wards of the state, subject to federal law and policy, not as separate political entities. This paved the way for the expansion of the reservation system.
Where most tribes were eventually confined.
Confined, often on lands unsuitable for their traditional ways of life, stripped of sovereignty, and dependent on those government rations we mentioned earlier, especially after the buffalo were gone.
There's a really famous example of a treaty being broken that led to major conflict involving the Sioux and the Black Hills.
Yes, the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868. It explicitly guaranteed the Sioux control over the Black Hills, in present-day South Dakota, sacred land for them.
But then
Gold was discovered there in the 1870s. Prospectors flooded in, violating the treaty. The U.S. government tried to buy or lease the land. The Sioux refused, and the government eventually just broke the treaty and sent in the army.
leading to the Great Sioux War.
Right, part of the longer series of conflicts, sometimes called the Sioux Wars. And while the Sioux and their allies won some major victories, famously wiping out Custer's 7th Cavalry Division at the Little Bighorn in 1876.
A huge shock to the U.S.
A massive shock. But ultimately, the constant military pressure, the dwindling resources, especially the loss of the buffalo, forced most bands onto reservations.
So there's the military force, the policy changes, the land seizure. But there was another element too, wasn't there? An attempt to change native culture itself.
Yes, and this is perhaps the most insidious part of the policy, forced assimilation. The goal wasn't just to control native peoples physically, but to eradicate their distinct cultures, languages, and identities.
How did they try to do that?
The primary tool became the off-reservation boarding school. The most famous example is the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, founded in 1879 by Richard Henry Pratt.
And Pratt had a very clear and very chilling philosophy.
He did. His infamous motto was, "Kill the Indian, save the man."
Kill the Indian, save the man. Just, wow, what did that mean in practice?
It meant taking native children, often forcibly, from their families and communities, sometimes hundreds or thousands of miles away. At the schools, they were forbidden from speaking their native languages, practicing their religions, or wearing traditional clothing. Their hair was cut, they were given English names, and they were drilled in English, Christianity, and vocational skills suited for assimilation into the lowest rungs of white society.
And Carlisle wasn't unique.
Not at all. It became the model. Similar schools sprang up across the country, like the Puyallup Indian School here in the West, all focused on this goal of cultural erasure, trying to break the connection between generations.
It's horrifying. But despite all this pressure, military, political, cultural, did native resistance completely end?
No, resilience was incredible, though overt armed resistance became increasingly difficult. But resistance took other forms, including spiritual ones.
You're talking about the ghost dance.
Yes, the ghost dance movement that swept across many Plains tribes in the late 1880s. It was a spiritual revival, prophesying that if people danced and lived righteously, the buffalo would return, the ancestors would come back, and the white settlers would disappear.
A message of hope and renewal? How did the U.S. government see it?
They saw it as a threat, as incitement, potentially, to renewed conflict. The ghost dance unnerved reservation agents and military commanders.
And this led directly to one of the final tragedies of this era.
Tragically, yes. Fear and misunderstanding surrounding the ghost dance led to the U.S. Army confronting a band of Lakota Sioux, many of whom were practitioners, at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota in December 1890.
The Wounded Knee Massacre.
Yes. Firing broke out. It's disputed exactly how, but the result was the soldiers opening fire with rifles and Hotchkiss guns on the mostly unarmed Lakota camp. Over 200 men, women, and children were killed.
It's often seen as the end point, isn't it? The end of the Indian Wars.
It effectively marked the end of large-scale, overt armed resistance on the plains. But it didn't end the spirit of defiance. You still had incredibly important figures like Sitting Bull, the Hunkpapa Lakota leader, who was actually killed shortly before Wounded Knee during an attempt to arrest him related to the ghost dance fears.
And others who resisted assimilation through different means.
Absolutely. People like Luther Standing Bear, a Lakota Sioux writer who actually attended Carlisle but later became a powerful critic of the assimilation policies and an advocate for preserving Native culture and rights. Resistance continued, just in different, often more subtle ways.
So looking back at this whole period, 1877 to 1898, it's just packed with these intense contradictions.
It really is. You have this powerful American ideal of independence, of self-sufficiency, driving expansion.
But achieving it seems to have required incredible violence and the systemic dismantling of other people's independence and sovereignty.
That's the tension laid bare. If you connect the dots, the railroads driving settlement, the economic pressures on small farmers, the deliberate destruction of the bison, the treaty violations, the land rushes, the assimilation policies,
It all points to a massive economic and geographic transformation of the West.
achieved directly at the expense of native sovereignty, Mexican-American land rights, and distinct cultural identities. The closing of the frontier wasn't just a line on a map disappearing. It was a forceful imposition of a new order.
So the frontier is declared closed in 1890. The physical expansion, at least within the contiguous U.S., is largely done. What's the takeaway for the country going forward?
Well, it loops back to Turner in a way. If he was right, even partially, that the frontier acted as that crucial safety valve for American democracy, absorbing discontent.
And then what happens now that it's gone?
Exactly. What are the long-term consequences, politically, socially, economically, of losing that geographical outlet? Who does America become when it can no longer expand outwards to solve its internal pressures? That question, born in this era, arguably shapes so much of the American century that follows.
A really powerful question to end on, something for all of you to think about as you process this deep dive.